And we've heard a bit about how to do responsive web design today. So I'm going to talk about how we might do it in the future. Because CSS Layout actually hasn't changed that much for a very long time. We're able to do quite a lot more things with CSS these days, but actually layout, we're still using floats and positioning and the sort of things we were using, quite a few years ago. But I think that's kind of going to change, and there's some really, really interesting stuff in the CSS3 specification, some of the modules, that are really going to change how we lay out our sites. I'll touch a little bit on the first one of those, and that's Multicolumn Layout. This has been around for a while, and it's probably got the best browser support of what I'm going to talk about today. What I will say is that most of the stuff I'm talking about today only works in one browser, sometimes quite surprising browsers, and most of it will need vendor prefixes. I'm not showing the vendor prefixes, but if you go and use this stuff, it's likely that you're going to have to use some sort of vendor prefixes to get it working. So multi-column layout makes it possible to take some content and arrange it in columns. It'll then flow pretty much as content flows in a newspaper, starting in the first column and flowing to evenly fill each column in turn. Columns are specified on their containing element. So in this case, the class call wrapper has been applied to the div you can see with the light background colour. If I want to flow that into columns, I can specify the width there with column width, and the browser will work out how many columns are going to fit into the space. Or I can use column count. In that case, the browser will work out how wide each column will be to get that many columns in. You can control the gutters, that's the gaps there between the columns with column gap. And you can also set rules between columns using the column rule property. And it takes values much like border does. It's worth remembering if you're using column rule, it doesn't take up any space itself. It basically overlays the column gap. So your gap needs to be sufficient to give space for your rule. If you want to have quite a wide rule, it'll overlay the text if you don't give enough space in the gap. You can also use column span. In this case, I've got the H1 there. That's actually within the columns, but I've used column span to ask it to span all of the columns. And you can do that with internal things as well. You could have a heading halfway down that spanned across all the columns. So that's sort of quite a newspaper-like way of laying things out. So it's got reasonable browser support with IE10. I mean, some of these things you need to use vendor prefixes, and also some of the break properties, which allow you to do things like decide where you break when a column wraps, and break when you're printing and things. They don't work in all browsers yet, but there's reasonable support. Particularly if you want to do things like this. Those checkboxes there are laid out with multi-column. Little things like that, UI elements, it doesn't need to be thought of something that you use for doing a sort of newspaper-like design, which actually isn't that useful on the web, because people don't want to scroll up and down to read things generally. But small UI elements, it's really, really good for. It's also responsive really by default. You've actually got to work quite hard to constrain these things. As I mentioned, with the when you decide on like a number of columns, the browser will just work out how wide they should be. If you set a width, it's not an actual fixed width. That's kind of like the ideal width you want. Unless the container's fixed, the browser will sort of work out the nearest width to that width you've chosen. So it's pretty responsive by default. Images placed in columns will be constrained by the column width. So the standard method for responsive design is scaling down the image using max width. That'll work just fine. The nice thing about this is that it falls back to a single column. If you don't really need to polyfill this. If the browser doesn't support it, you get a single column. A lot of the time, that's going to be absolutely fine, especially for things like little checkboxes in a UI. If they end up a single column, that's not the end of the world. If you've got a newer browser and you get the multi-column, well, great. I probably wouldn't try and polyfill this stuff. There's some resources. I'll be publishing these slides later. I'll tweet about them. You don't need to write all these down. Also, the link's got all this stuff linked up. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is Flexbox, Flexible Box Layout Module. And that seems to have got, suddenly, a whole bunch of people talking about it. It's a really useful thing. Flexbox gives us this brand new layout mode in CSS. It's been designed to make it easy to lay out complex applications and web pages and UI elements. And it really solves some of the really big problems that we have when we're doing layout with CSS. So spacing things evenly along a line. That's kind of one of those things that print designers, when they come to web design, they're like, what do you mean you can't easily just space those things out? You've got a group of things, you want to spread them out evenly, and that shouldn't be difficult. And it has been up to now, but not so with Flexbox. So I've got an application list, and by default that's just displaying one underneath the other. To space these evenly, I simply set them to display flex, and then use the justify content property to decide whether I want space around the elements, in which case we get equal space each side, which means that if you can see on that image there, the elements don't bump up against the side because there's some space around each element. If I wanted them to line up flush with the text there, I could use space between, and that just nicely spaces them out and they line up neatly on the left and the right. No negative margins needed, or doing something special on first child, or any of the other nasty things that we do every day. Flexbox is great. The items here are displayed as a row, and that's because we're using the flex direction property set to row. You can also do some quite nifty things with this. You can set it to row reverse, and they'll just reverse the order. That's quite cool. You can also set them to column and column reverse, and that does what you'd expect. The other thing that Flexbox does, which is really cool, is lets you create equal height boxes. Another thing that baffles print designers, why can't we have 3 equal height boxes? Why doesn't everything stretch to the height of the tallest? And the reason it doesn't is because we don't have very good ways of saying that things are related to each other in CSS. And Flexbox lets us do that. It lets us say, these things relate to each other, they should be the same height. So items within a Flex container, they have a relationship. So I've got these 3 boxes here in my markup. And the key to these equal height boxes is the align items property. The default value of stretch means that all of the items will stretch to the height of the tallest, just like that. If you set that value to center, the boxes will center against each other. And you can set it to flex end and they'll line up at the bottom. Really easy, really cool. Why haven't we been able to do this before? We can also use the order property on flex items to assign them an order, in addition to just being able to set the direction and reverse it. Now to me, anything that lets us get away from having our layout dictated by source order is brilliant and is game-changing. Because at the moment, especially doing responsive design, and I was working with a designer and he was like, well, in the mobile layout, things could be in this order, that would be best for mobile users, and for the desktop we want to put them over here, and you're kind of making decisions and trying to force actually your document structure to get these different layouts. And so some of these new modules really let you properly separate the document structure from the way it looks, and to me that's the holy grail. As someone who's been doing this for a very long time, that's really what I want. So this order property lets you order things in whichever way you like. So we can just switch them around. Now, Flexbox gives us a really good example of how these early stage specs change. There was an early working draft of Flexbox that got implemented into some browsers. It then changed twice. And so there are 2 lots of old Flexbox out there, and there's also the new Flexbox, which is probably what's going to now go forward and be the sort of final spec. This article on CSS Tricks tells you how you know whether the resource you're reading is about old Flexbox or new Flexbox, although some browsers still support old Flexbox. So if you want to use Flexbox, you have to kind of use both. So there's some resources I've got that tell you how to do that. Here's the browser support chart. So there's actually reasonable support, but the ones that are showing as having partial support are those that support old Flexbox. It would be possible to polyfill Flexbox, and there are things out there that are trying to do that. However, you may find that you can say use something like Modernizer and use the Flexbox layout for those that support it, and those that don't, use something else, use floats and things, and maybe have things not lined up quite as neatly. Here's some resources. There's a couple of things came out in the last week that look really cool to do with Flexbox. Again, I'll publish these, you can have a look at them later. I really would say have a look at this. It's getting to a point now where you can really start to use Flexbox, if you're careful, with the appropriate vendor prefixes. Now this is my favourite. I've spent ages messing around with this and writing about it over the last few months. I really, really like CSS Grid Layout, and I want everybody to look at it and demand it in their browsers because I want to be able to use it. So really, I'm just going around speaking about this stuff to try and encourage people to use Grid. So yeah, Grid solves a lot of the problems that we have in terms of laying out pages. Unfortunately, it's really, really hard to demonstrate in the current working draft form because it's just changed. And the implementation we do have out there is in Internet Explorer 10. It's actually a Microsoft proposal originally. So the examples I'm going to show you use the new syntax. I've got a load of sort of things which you can have a look at, but they're actually using the IE10 syntax because that's the only thing we've got out there. We haven't got a browser that supports the new syntax yet. Grid lets us define a grid on an element and then position child elements on the grid. Crucially, where those elements are placed has no bearing on their order in the source, as long as they're a child of that parent grid. So it's a bit like absolute positioning, except because you've got a grid, you don't have that problem of things overlaying each other, because they have relationship. So to use grid, we first take our containing element, so some sort of wrapping div or whatever, and we set it to display grid. It's a new value for the display property. We then define a grid. So perhaps we want a grid that's got fixed width sidebars, a 20 pixel gutter between each sidebar, and a main sort of stretchy content area in the middle, like an old school liquid layout. So that's how we do this with grid definition columns, just setting up the columns. And then we've got a couple of rows there with grid definition rows. And the minute we do this, if we've got some HTML inside our wrapper, what happens is everything will stack up in the corner. The reason all the elements are stacked up in the corner is because we've declared a grid and they're all sitting in the top left corner of the grid because they've not got any positioning. So we now need to start putting those elements, the title and the article and the nav and the block quote, we need to start positioning them onto the grid. So I'll start with the content. We've got a 5-column grid and the 20 pixel gutters count as columns, so anything counts as a column. And the value of grid start is the line before the column that we want the content in, and grid end is the line after the content. Grid before is the row line before the content, and grid after is the row line after the content. This does start to make more sense the more you do it. So essentially, here's how we're positioning the other bits. And we're basically just plonking them where we want them on the grid. If we look at it with some lines, it kind of makes a bit more sense. Basically, when you place an item, you're declaring the grid lines around it. So for that main content area, you can see we've got the first line, number 1 is that top line, and then for the second row is the second line there. You're actually kind of drawing the box around it with your lines. Now the problem is, I say this would be much easier if you could play around with it, and you can't play around with it because nothing actually supports that syntax yet. What things do support is the old Microsoft syntax, which looks a bit like this. I've used the prefixes so you can just sort of see that they're Microsoft ones. We display MS Grid columns. We've lost the definition word in there. That's defining the grid, so that's more or less the same. It gets completely different once we start actually laying things out on the grid. So this is the Microsoft implementation. This is just the way of the world with these early stage specs. Microsoft proposed it, they implemented it in IE10, we're getting implementation experience. When I first saw the new syntax, I thought actually this old IE syntax is easier because what you're saying with the Microsoft IE10 syntax is I'm going to put it on column number 2. But actually, I think the more I play with it, I think this idea of grid lines makes a bit more sense in terms of grid systems. However, the stuff you're going to see out there working at the moment is going to be the IE10 syntax because that's the implementation. I've been writing a bit about grid. I've got several examples that work in IE10, which you can see and play around with. I've also written up the differences between the IE10 syntax and the new syntax on my blog, and all those links are in my resources. So basically, you can't really use this right now. You've got IE10 with the old syntax. It's not something ready for use, but I think it's a really, really exciting proposal, and the more I've played with it, the more I've thought this really does solve an awful lot of the problems we've got. The working draft is full of requests for feedback on naming, and full of places where it actually says, you know, that this naming isn't great, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, they want feedback. If you're interested in this stuff, play with it, join the do style mailing list, and actually give feedback to the process and let people know how you think these things should work. And that goes for any of these early stage specs, you know, you can contribute. Here's a bunch of resources, most of them are mine. But yeah, do have a look and have a play around. I think it's really interesting. CSS Regions. This is another really nice spec that I think, again, matches up very well with how people who've come from the print world see the web and layout. And it's actually come from Adobe. The original proposal was made by Adobe. So regions let you flow content through multiple containers independently of the source order, which sounds a bit odd in a web context. But if you think about you know, print design and things like InDesign, you often take a kind of thread of content and then say, I want to spread this through these boxes. And that's kind of what this allows you to do. So here's my HTML. I've got an article element. It contains the entire content of my article, just as a big block of text. I've then added a number of empty elements at the bottom of the document. So first I use this new CSS property flow into, which would need a WebKit prefix at the moment. This stuff does work in Chrome Canary with the experimental flags turned on, and you can actually play around with it. So you're declaring that it's flow into an article thread is just a name. That could be anything. It could be cabbages or sausages or whatever you like. That's just a name that you give it. So once you do this, the content disappears because you haven't specified anywhere for it to go. So the next thing is to say where that content goes. Each of my empty elements has got a class of article regions, so I can now target that class as being the recipient of content. And we use the flow from property with a value being the name that we used earlier, so I've got article thread. If you now refresh your page, the content would reappear and it's flowing into the first of the regions. And then with the content flow, we can start to lay it out by applying CSS to specific regions. So my first region, I think I'm going to give it a height. So that basically would mean that only a certain amount of content is going to get into that region, and then it's going to need to go somewhere else. I've got 3 regions I'm going to lay out as columns, and I'm using Flexbox. Regions doesn't give any layout properties. You lay it out, you know, you lay out your page whatever you want, your boxes with whatever you want, and then you just use regions to flow content into them. So I've just laid these out with Flexbox. So region 1 there is the first couple of lines at the top, and then it flows into those 3 columns, and then because those columns have got a height, it needs to go somewhere else. So I create region 5, which has a height of auto and takes the rest of the content. Regions don't have to be adjacent. If I decide this page lacks cabbage drawings, and so I take the class off the central region 3 and pop in a cabbage image, and now the content flows from region 1, and then misses out that middle region, which now doesn't have a class to say it's been targeted, and just carries on. So this means we can insert elements without breaking up the content flow. As someone who develops a content management system product, that is very, very interesting. Currently, you pretty much can't use this unless you want to get Chrome Canary and put on the experimental WebKit features. So those examples do work in Canary. But I think because it is getting into Chrome, and hopefully we're going to start seeing this in other browsers, I think it's an interesting spec, and it's certainly got quite a bit of support out there. There are quite a few examples out there, and if you have a browser that supports it, you can have a look at those. So my final spec that I'm going to look at is again from Adobe with the help of Microsoft, and that's CSS Exclusions and Shapes. So if you've ever wanted to flow text around a shape, or cut out a shape in the middle of content, then you'll be interested in this one. An earlier specification is out there which referred to positioned floats, which probably says more about what this is about, and that's superseded by the current working draft. So we're all familiar with using floats in CSS. The thing with floats is you can float something and things will go around the side of it and underneath, but you can't just stick something in the middle of some content and have the content all flow around it. Again, something that baffles print designers. So this is the thing that the first part of the exclusions module solves. So a markup's a simple block of text marked as an article with the class of main, and below this I've got a div containing an image. I'd like the image to appear floated inside the copy with the text wrapping around. So first of all, I position the image. As with regions, exclusions doesn't add a new positioning method. So to keep things simple, I'm just using absolute positioning to place the image, which of course will then appear sat on top of the text. I then need to make an exclusion. And I do that by setting wrap flow both. And the content now honours the position of that element and flows around it, as simple as that. That's really, really neat, really, really useful. Again, that's something that would be really handy to have in CSS. There's other really bonkers stuff you can do with this. Then you can do things like, flow things around a shape. Crazy, crazy stuff. There are some examples on the Adobe site which I've linked to, which you can have a look at. So I think it's really quite interesting that this sort of more print-like stuff is getting into CSS. It'd be interesting to see where it goes. Again, this is something that doesn't have a lot of browser support. You need to turn on experimental features to have a play around with it. But if you fancy doing that, there are some things on CodePen from Adobe, which you can have a play around with and see. So with that, I'm kind of done with this rapid roundup of what's new in CSS. Slides and links to resources can be found at the URL there, and I will tweet them later as well on the hashtag. So thanks very much for listening.